The disabled billionaire pretended to be homeless for 1 week. What he discovered broke him. There are certain kinds of silence that hurt more than insults. The silence when people look away from you in public. The silence after you ask for help and nobody moves. The silence that says, "You are no longer someone the world respects." Ethan Cole learned that silence the night a little boy asked his mother why the broken man was sitting outside the restaurant window. And the mother didn't correct him. She simply pulled her son closer and whispered, "Don't stare." The rain was falling hard that night in downtown Chicago. People in $1,000 coats rushed past glowing storefronts while Ethan sat in a wheelchair beneath a flickering streetlight, soaked to the bone, holding a paper cup that only had 3 crumpled dollar bills inside it. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew the disabled man sitting in the rain owned half the buildings on that street. But that wasn't even the part that broke him. What broke him was discovering how differently the world treated people the moment they looked weak. And before this story ends, one woman will betray him. One employee will humiliate him. One child will restore his faith in humanity. And an entire company will fall silent when they discover the truth. Because sometimes, the cruelest thing about this world is not poverty. It's how quickly people stop seeing your humanity. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from tonight. And if stories about life, truth, and human nature move you deeply, subscribe now. Because this story is one you will never forget. Who was Ethan Cole before the wheelchair? Why would a billionaire willingly disappear into homelessness? Was this an experiment? A punishment? Or was he searching for something money could no longer buy? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what happens when a man who owns everything realizes the world only respects him when they can see his power? Over the next 7 days, Ethan will encounter cruelty he never imagined. Inside restaurants he owned, inside companies he built, and even inside the heart of someone he thought loved him. But hidden beneath the humiliation is a truth so painful. It will force him to confront the one thing wealth could never protect him from: loneliness. Before the accident, Ethan Cole was the kind of billionaire magazines loved to photograph. Tall, confident, sharp-minded. The founder of Cole Urban Holdings, a real estate empire worth billions across Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, and New York. People admired him not just because he was wealthy, but because he came from nothing. His father had been a city bus driver. His mother worked nights at a hospital laundry room. Ethan built everything himself. And for years, the world treated him like proof that hard work could still conquer anything. Until the bridge accident. It happened on a snowy December night 5 years earlier. A truck lost control near the overpass outside Milwaukee. 3 vehicles were crushed. 2 people died instantly. Ethan survived. But his spine did not. The man who once walked into boardrooms like he owned the future woke up unable to move his legs. And suddenly, the world looked at him differently. At first it was subtle. People speaking slower around him. Business rivals assuming he was mentally weaker because he sat in a wheelchair. Women who once admired him suddenly treating him with pity. Investors talking to his assistants instead of him. Then came the worst part. The loneliness. Because disability doesn't only change how you move through the world. Sometimes, it changes how the world moves around you. Even his fiancée, Vanessa, began changing. Not cruelly at first. Just gradually. Missed dinners. Shorter conversations. Eyes that no longer held warmth. Ethan noticed all of it. But he said nothing. Because deep down, he feared she was grieving the man he used to be. And maybe, so was he. The idea came to Ethan after overhearing 2 executives speaking inside his company headquarters. They didn't know he was nearby. One of them laughed and said, "People only care about disabled folks when cameras are around." The other replied, "Truthfully, most of them become burdens." Burdens. The word stayed in Ethan's mind for days, then weeks, until one morning, he made a decision that shocked even his closest assistant. For 7 days, he would disappear. No security, no billionaire identity, no luxury penthouse, just a wheelchair, old clothes, and the truth. He wanted to know how the world treated people once status disappeared. What he discovered would change him forever. His longtime assistant, a loyal young man named Derek, begged him not to go through with it. "Mr. Cole, this isn't safe," Derek said. standing in the doorway with his hands clasped together the way he always did when he was genuinely afraid. Ethan looked at him calmly and said, "Derek, if I can't survive 1 week as who I actually am right now, then what does that say about the world I've been funding?" Derek had no answer. He helped Ethan pack a worn army green duffel bag, a few sets of old clothes, a weathered gray hoodie, a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, no phone with his contacts, no credit cards, just $60 in cash, a prepaid burner cell, and a folding wheelchair they purchased secondhand from a thrift store 2 towns over so nobody would recognize it as his custom medical model. Ethan wore no watch, no ring, nothing that would signal money. Before Derek drove away, he looked into the rearview mirror at Ethan sitting on a bus bench and felt his stomach drop. Because his boss, the most powerful man he'd ever worked for, already looked invisible. The first morning hit Ethan like cold water. He positioned himself outside a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, a stretch of Chicago so familiar to him that he'd walked it hundreds of times in tailored suits, nodding at doormen who knew his name. Now those same doormen looked through him. He sat near the entrance in the second-hand wheelchair, watching the morning crowd rush past. Suits, heels clicking on wet pavement, the smell of coffee and rain mixing in the early air. A woman in a camel coat nearly walked directly into him, caught herself, gave him a look that was somehow equal parts irritation and pity, and moved on without a word. Not, "Excuse me," not, "I'm sorry," just a look, and she was gone. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He thought, she would have apologized to a lamppost before she apologized to me. He wasn't wrong. That was day 1, hour 1. And it only got harder from there. By mid-morning, Ethan rolled toward the coffee shop entrance and pushed the door. It was heavy, the kind of door with a thick brass handle that required both hands to open properly. He pushed. The door barely moved. 3 people walked in behind him. None of them held it. Not one. He finally got it open by angling his chair sideways and pressing his shoulder against it. As he entered, a barista at the counter glanced at him, then immediately turned to the next customer in line, a man who had walked in a full 30 seconds after Ethan. "Next," she said, bright and cheerful, completely over Ethan's head. Ethan said nothing. He waited. He ordered a small coffee, paid with crumpled bills, and found a corner table. He sat alone for 2 hours. And not a single person made eye contact with him. Think about that. 2 hours. In a room full of people. And he was completely invisible. Does that make you uncomfortable? Because it should. On Tuesday, Ethan decided to test something more specific. He rolled to one of his own restaurants. A mid-range American grill he'd opened 6 years ago called Ironwood Kitchen. A place he'd personally helped design, right down to the wide plank oak floors and the exposed brick walls. He had never once walked through those doors without being treated like royalty. He remembered the GM, a sharp woman named Patricia, always greeting him personally. The booth by the window always kept clear for him. Now, he sat outside in a light drizzle waiting for the rain to ease before going in. A hostess came to the door, looked out, saw him and disappeared back inside. Ethan waited. Several groups walked past him, went inside, and were seated within minutes. 11 minutes later, Ethan rolled to the entrance. The same hostess came back. She looked him up and down, slowly, and said, "We're at capacity right now. It might be a while." Ethan glanced past her shoulder. The dining room was less than half full. "I can see empty tables from here," he said quietly. She didn't flinch. "Those are reserved," she replied. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was something more calculated than cruelty. It was dismissal dressed up as professionalism. Ethan nodded slowly, turned his wheelchair around, and sat back in the rain. He sat there for another 14 minutes before a young busboy, maybe 19 years old, came outside on a break, noticed him and said, "Hey man, you good? You want me to bring you something?" Ethan almost didn't answer. He was too busy feeling the weight of what had just happened inside a building his name was on the deed of. "I'm all right," he said. "Thank you." The busboy nodded, disappeared inside, and came back 2 minutes later with a paper cup of hot coffee. No charge, no fanfare, just a kid doing what the adults in that building had failed to do. That busboy's name, Ethan would later learn, was Carlos. Wednesday brought something Ethan hadn't fully prepared for: public mockery. He had positioned himself near Millennium Park, watching tourists and locals pass through. A group of teenagers, maybe 16 or 17, walked by in the afternoon. One of them noticed Ethan, nudged his friend, and they slowed down. Ethan heard one of them say something, then laughter. Then one of them quietly lifted his phone and began recording. Ethan kept his face still. His jaw tightened slightly. He thought about all the board meetings he had run, all the negotiations he had won, all the moments in his life where people had listened when he spoke. And now, he was content for a teenager's entertainment on a Wednesday afternoon. He said nothing, because he understood something critical in that moment. This is what millions of people live with every single day. Not just disabled people. Not just homeless people. Anyone society decides is less than. And those teenagers weren't even evil. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. They weren't hateful people by nature. They had simply never been taught, truly taught, that dignity does not disappear when a body changes. Research published in 2023 found that people with disabilities continue to face significant barriers in public life and everyday social settings, and that over 30 years, very little has meaningfully improved. 30 years. Think about that. Ethan was living inside a statistic he had never personally felt before, and it was suffocating. By Thursday, the physical toll was beginning to stack. Sleeping in a shelter the first 2 nights had been one thing, but the shelter's accessible bathroom had a broken grab rail that nobody had fixed. He'd noticed 2 other wheelchair users at the shelter. He watched how staff spoke to them, with exaggerated slowness, as though the wheelchair had somehow affected their hearing or their intelligence. Ethan thought about every accessibility audit his company had ever skipped or delayed. He thought about every time a board member had argued that compliance costs too much. He felt sick. He spent Thursday afternoon outside the headquarters of Cole Urban Holdings itself. The building his company occupied. 42 floors. Glass and steel. He had personally approved the architectural plans in 2016. He now sat across the street and watched his own employees pour in and out through the revolving doors. Nobody recognized him. Of course they didn't. Because we don't look closely at people we've already decided don't belong in our space. A man in a navy suit, Ethan recognized him as a senior VP named Richard, walked directly past him. Richard had worked for Ethan for 8 years. He'd attended Ethan's birthday dinner twice. He walked past him without a glance. Like furniture. Like a fire hydrant. Like something the city had placed there and forgotten to remove. Ethan watched the door of his own building for 2 hours. Then he made a call on the burner phone. Not to Derek. Not to call off the experiment. He called a nonprofit he had donated to 3 years ago but never closely followed. A Chicago organization that helped disabled veterans find stable housing. He asked the director, a woman named Gloria, how things were going. Honestly, she said, we have more need than ever and half our funding just got cut. Ethan said he would look into it. He meant it. Friday was the day Ethan had dreaded since before the experiment even began. Because Friday was the night of the annual Cole Urban Holdings Charity Gala. An event his company hosted at the Langham Hotel, raising money for urban development initiatives. And Vanessa would be there. Vanessa Holt, his fiancée of 2 years. Or rather, his former fiancée. Because in the 3 weeks leading up to this experiment, something between them had fractured so quietly that neither of them had found the courage to name it out loud. Vanessa was a former fashion consultant turned lifestyle brand executive. She was striking in the way that made rooms quieter when she entered. And she had been one of the first people, after the accident, to tell Ethan she loved him just the same. He had believed her. For a long time he had believed her completely. But belief is a tender thing. And it doesn't survive the slow drip of a person pulling away. Ethan positioned his wheelchair outside the Langham side entrance, about 30 feet from the carpet where event guests were arriving. He wore his gray hoodie, his old sneakers. He looked exactly like what he was pretending to be. A man society had left behind. He watched the cars pull up. He watched people in gowns and tuxedos walk beneath the hotel canopy, laughing and greeting each other. And then he saw her. Vanessa stepped out of a black car in a silver gown that caught every light on the block. She looked stunning. And Ethan felt something complicated in his chest that wasn't quite love and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the space between both. He called her name, quietly at first, then slightly louder. She was 30 feet away. She slowed, turned, and for one long second, She didn't recognize him. That second felt like a year. Then recognition landed on her face. And it was followed, not by relief, not by concern, but by something Ethan would describe later as horror at being seen. She walked toward him quickly, not to embrace him, to contain the situation. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, scanning the crowd behind her. "What are you doing? This is embarrassing." "I just wanted to see you," he said. It was true. It was the most honest thing he had said all week. She looked at him, at the wheelchair, at the old clothes, at the paper cup on his lap, and she said, "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I loved who you were. But you're not that man anymore. And I can't keep pretending that this is okay." And then she straightened her gown, turned around, and walked up the steps into the hotel without looking back. Ethan sat in the cold for a long time after that. The sounds of the city wrapped around him. A car horn somewhere. The distant thump of music from inside the hotel. The smell of exhaust and perfume hanging in the night air. He didn't cry immediately. He just sat. And then, slowly, with his hands resting on the wheels of the second-hand chair, he cried. Not for Vanessa. Not for himself exactly. He cried because he finally understood something that no amount of wealth had ever been able to teach him. Some people's love has a price tag. And the moment you stop being worth something to them on paper, you stop being worth something to them at all. Ask yourself right now, honestly, have you ever pulled away from someone because they seemed less impressive than before? Because they were struggling? Because they no longer fit the image you wanted to be associated with? This is the part of ourselves most people never examine. And Ethan was being forced to examine all of it at once. By Saturday morning, Ethan had not slept well in 5 days. His hands were cracked from the cold. His shoulders ached from maneuvering the manual wheelchair alone, because unlike his custom motorized chair at home, this second-hand one required pushing. He had developed a small but persistent pain along his left shoulder blade from compensating for the resistance of uneven sidewalks. He sat on a bench near the river and ate a breakfast sandwich from a convenience store. A woman walking a golden retriever passed by. The dog approached Ethan, tail wagging, and licked his hand. The woman yanked the leash and said sharply, "Duke, leave it, leave it. Not come here, boy, or I'm so sorry. Leave it." As if Ethan were a piece of trash on the sidewalk that the dog had wandered too close to. He looked down at his hand where the dog had licked it and thought. The dog had more instinct for kindness than its owner. That afternoon, he returned to the area near his building and watched the Saturday foot traffic. Families, couples, joggers, a man selling flowers on the corner, children eating ice cream. Chicago was beautiful in the early spring. He had always loved the city. And for the first time in 5 years, he wondered if the city or any city was actually built to include people like him. Not the billionaire version of him. The version sitting in a used wheelchair, eating a gas station breakfast sandwich, invisible to the people walking their dogs. A 2024 study confirmed what Ethan was experiencing in real time, that people with physical disabilities consistently report being ignored, spoken over, or excluded from public spaces in ways so ordinary and so routine that they become nearly impossible to prove. Because each individual moment seems small. A door not held. A table not offered. A look that lasts too long. Isolated, they feel like nothing. Together, they are a life lived at half the volume the world allows everyone else. Ethan thought about Carlos, the 19-year-old busboy who had brought him coffee in the rain. He thought about how little it had cost that boy to show kindness. Just 2 minutes and a paper cup. And he had made Ethan feel more seen than anyone else had in 4 days. On Sunday morning, Ethan called Derek. "I'm ready," he said. Derek arrived in 45 minutes. He pulled up in the company's black SUV, stepped out, and when he saw Ethan, the circles under his eyes, the cracked hands, the rumpled hoodie, the second-hand wheelchair, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, I'm so sorry." Ethan shook his head. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Just drive." But he didn't ask Derek to take him home. He asked Derek to take him to Cole Urban Holdings. On a Sunday. "I need to see it," Ethan said. "Before I clean up, before I put the suit back on. I need to see it like this." Derek drove to headquarters. He helped Ethan from the SUV and stood back as Ethan, in the old hoodie and the second-hand chair, sat in front of the glass and steel building he had spent 20 years building. He sat there for a while. just looking at it. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, I built this for people who look exactly like me right now. And I forgot that completely. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, I'm still here. Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Hit the subscribe button if you have not done so. What happened next is the part of this story most people cannot fully believe. But it is the part that mattered most. On Monday morning, Ethan returned to Cole Urban Holdings. Still in the hoodie. Still in the second-hand wheelchair. No announcement. No Derek waiting inside. He rolled to the front entrance alone and pushed through the lobby doors. The security desk was staffed by a man named Frank, a guard who had worked for the company for 6 years. Frank looked up, saw a man in worn clothes in a wheelchair, and said immediately, Sir, this is a private building. Can I help you? I'm here to see my office, Ethan said. Frank frowned. Do you have an appointment? I don't need one, Ethan replied. This is my building. Frank, to his credit, did not laugh. But he did stand up and move around the desk. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. 2 other employees walking through the lobby stopped and stared. One of them, a junior analyst Ethan recognized from a company meeting, whispered something to her colleague. Neither intervened. Then the elevator doors on the far side of the lobby opened. And out walked Maya Reyes. Maya was a 24-year-old intern who had started 3 months ago in the corporate social responsibility division. She was carrying a stack of folders and a coffee in a to-go cup. She saw the commotion near the entrance. She saw a man in a wheelchair being turned away. And without hesitation, without knowing who he was, without checking with anyone, without calculating what it might cost her, she walked over and said, Hey, is everything okay over here? Frank looked at her. In turn, this doesn't concern you. Maya looked at the man in the wheelchair and said to Ethan directly, Do you need help? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I could use a coffee, actually, and maybe a place to sit for a few minutes. Maya nodded. I've got coffee. Follow me. She led him to the employee break room on the ground floor. She poured him a coffee. She sat across from him and said, Are you lost? Do you need us to call someone for you? And then she paused, looked at him more carefully and said, I'm sorry, I don't even know your name. Ethan said, My name is Ethan. She said, I'm Maya. It's nice to meet you, Ethan. She didn't say anything else. She just sat with him. Not with pity. Not with performance. Just with him. 2 humans in a break room drinking coffee. That was the moment. That small, ordinary, unwitnessed moment. That was the one that cracked Ethan Cole completely open. 20 minutes later, the board members arrived for the Monday morning executive briefing. They poured off the elevators in pressed suits, carrying leather portfolios, speaking in the low, confident voices of people who had never once questioned whether they deserved the rooms they walked into. They found Frank at the security desk looking visibly stressed. They found 2 employees still standing awkwardly near the entrance. And they found, in the break room just off the lobby, their company's founder and CEO, in a gray hoodie, drinking coffee with a junior intern. The board chairman, a silver-haired man named Gerald, stepped into the break room doorway. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds. First, confusion. Then, recognition. Then, something very close to shame. Ethan looked up at him calmly. Good morning, Gerald. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a group of powerful people suddenly realizes they have been caught. Not by a camera, not by a reporter, but by their own behavior. Maya looked around at the executives, then back at Ethan. Then, slowly, understanding began moving across her face. Ethan could see the exact moment she understood who she had just made coffee for. Her eyes widened slightly. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if to say it doesn't change anything. And to her enormous credit, she nodded, like she already knew that. Ethan called a mandatory all-hands meeting for the following morning. Every employee, every floor, no exceptions. Word traveled fast, as it always does inside a company when something significant has shifted. By the time Ethan rolled into the main conference hall on Tuesday morning, now in his custom wheelchair, in a clean suit, his presence unmistakable, the room was full and utterly silent. You could hear the ventilation system. You could hear someone in the back shift their weight. He positioned himself at the front of the room, looked out at the hundreds of faces staring back at him, and he did not speak immediately. He just looked. And then he began. "Last week," he said, "I spent 7 days living as a disabled, homeless man in this city, in this neighborhood, outside this building. And I want to tell you what I found." He paused. "I found that the people in this room, people I trust, people I pay well, people I have tried to build something meaningful with, walked past me every single day and never once stopped. Not to ask if I was okay. Not to offer help. Not even to look." The silence in the room deepened. "I found that a restaurant I owned turned me away from an empty dining room because of how I looked. I found that teenagers filmed me for entertainment. I found that a woman I planned to marry told me I was no longer the man she loved, because I appeared to have nothing." He let that sit. "And I found one person, a junior intern named Maya Reyes, who gave me coffee and sat with me like I was worth sitting with. Not because she knew who I was. She had no idea. She did it because she is the kind of person this company should be full of. And isn't." Several people in the room were visibly emotional. Some looked at their shoes. The senior VP Richard, the man who had walked past Ethan without recognition, was staring at the floor with his jaw tight. Vanessa was not there. She had resigned her advisory board position the previous evening by email. Ethan had read it and felt not anger, but something quieter, a kind of relief that truth had finally arrived, even if its cost was high. 3 months after the all-hands meeting, Ethan did something quiet and deliberate. He went back to Ironwood Kitchen, his restaurant. He walked in through the front entrance, no disguise this time, no wheelchair experiment. He sat at the bar and asked the manager on duty to call Carlos, the young busboy who had brought him coffee in the rain on day 2. Carlos came out from the kitchen looking confused and slightly terrified, the way young employees look when the boss suddenly knows their name. Ethan extended his hand. "You don't know this," Ethan said, "but 3 months ago, you were the kindest person I encountered all week, and I want you to know that it mattered." Carlos stared at him. Then he said, "The man in the wheelchair outside? That was you." Ethan nodded. Carlos looked like he needed a moment. Then he shook his head slowly and laughed. Not unkindly, but with the kind of astonished disbelief that sometimes comes out as laughter. "Man," he said, "I just didn't want you to be cold." "I know," Ethan said. "That's the whole point." Carlos was enrolled in a company-funded culinary training program the following month. Not because Ethan owed him anything, but because Carlos had demonstrated something that cannot be taught in any training manual, the instinct to treat a stranger like they matter. And Ethan had decided that instinct was worth investing in. What most people who followed this story publicly never knew, because it happened privately, quietly, in the way the most important changes always do, was what Ethan Cole discovered about himself during those 7 days. Not about his employees, not about the world, about himself. He discovered that for 5 years since the accident, he had been running. Not away from the wheelchair. He had accepted that with more grace than most people knew. He had been running from the vulnerability that came with it. He had poured himself back into work, into deals, into the construction of an image of invincibility, because allowing himself to be seen as changed, as diminished in any way by what had happened to him, felt unbearable. And so he had never fully grieved, never fully asked for help, never fully allowed anyone close enough to sit with him in the hard, unglamorous truth of what his daily life actually required. He had surrounded himself with people who treated him normally, which, he realized, he had interpreted as respect, but was sometimes just avoidance. Nobody wanted to ask him how he was really doing because his success made the question seem unnecessary. Wealth is a kind of armor, and like all armor, it eventually becomes its own kind of cage. The week without it had stripped everything back. And what was left? The man sitting in the rain, holding a paper cup with $3 in it, invisible to a world he helped build. That man was still him. Just unprotected. He started therapy 2 months after the experiment. He told almost nobody. His therapist, a quiet man named Dr. Warren, said something to him in their 3rd session that Ethan wrote down and kept on his desk. He said, "The hardest disability isn't physical. It's the belief that you are not allowed to need anything from anyone." Ethan looked at that sentence for a long time. Then he thought about Carlos, about Maya, about Darlene in the circle at the rehab center, about all the people who had offered him something: warmth, coffee, presents, without being asked. And he thought, maybe the whole point wasn't to find out how broken the world is. Maybe the point was to discover that even in the most invisible moments, there are still people who see you. You just have to stop being too proud to let yourself be seen. There is a painful truth hidden inside this story. Most people do not reveal their character when life is easy. They reveal it when standing in front of someone society considers powerless. A wheelchair, old clothes, a trembling hand. Those things should never erase a person's dignity. But every day, for millions of people, they do. Ethan Cole entered that week searching for honesty. What he found was something far more disturbing. He discovered how quickly the world stops seeing humanity once strength disappears. And maybe the real disability was never his broken body. Maybe it was the blindness inside the people around him. The willingness to walk past. The instinct to look away. The ease with which someone can be made invisible simply because the world has decided they no longer carry power. But here is what this story also found, and this is the part you need to sit with. There will always be a Carlos. There will always be a Maya. There will always be a Darlene in a circle somewhere, who has lived through the hardest version of this and came out the other side with enough warmth left to hand it to a stranger. The question isn't whether those people exist. The question is whether you are one of them. Think about the last time you were in a public place. Think about the last time you noticed someone who was struggling. Think about what you did or didn't do in that moment. Not to judge yourself, but to ask honestly, if that had been someone you loved, would you have acted differently? And if the answer is yes, then the gap between how you treat strangers and how you treat people you love, that gap is worth closing. Because the man sitting in the rain outside your restaurant window, the woman in the wheelchair at the coffee shop door, the teenager on the park bench who hasn't eaten, they are all someone's Ethan. They are all someone's whole world. They just don't look like it from the outside. And that is exactly the problem. Ethan Cole is still building, still leading, still in his wheelchair, still, on some mornings, sitting quietly by the river with a coffee from that same convenience store. Not because he has to, but because he wants to remember. Because forgetting is easy. And remembering is the only thing that keeps us human. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs this reminder today. And subscribe for more powerful stories about life, truth, and the hidden side of human nature. Because the stories that change us are rarely the comfortable ones. They are the ones that sit in the silence with us. The ones that ask, who would you be if nobody was watching? And then dare us to be that person anyway.